Hello and welcome back to our second keynote live session of the day. Thank you all for joining us. A few bits of information before we get underway in case you've just joined the live stream. There's a chat panel located on the right-hand side of the GRIP platform. Please feel free to ask us any questions and we'll do our best to pass these along to our speaker. We'll try to get through them all, but if we don't manage to, don't worry, as they're all saved down in the system and we'll get back to you after the event. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Emery Craig, co-founder and CEO of Digital Bodies. Professor Emery, we're thrilled to see you again, and thank you so much for being with us today. We hope that the audience enjoys this session, and I'll now hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and I especially want to thank the conference organizers. There's been excellent presentations over this two-day event, but what you don't see is the amazing group of people working behind the scenes. They really have a global perspective, which is, of course, fitting of Dubai, and put together an outstanding conference. So if you have a chance to come to a face-to-face event later on in future year, I highly recommend it. This conference also has a special meaning for me, as I was at the last Guest Dubai Summit last year, and it was the last in-person talk that I did. I flew back to New York City within weeks found myself at the epicenter of a global pandemic. So with that, we'll begin. As co-founder and CEO of Digital Bodies, we do a lot of work in the education space, both K-12 and higher education. And of course, the pandemic has deeply affected us. All of our workshops, our design thinking sessions, our storytelling, learning strategy, and VR labs have had to transition to an online environment. So we've been faced with many of the same challenges that both K-12 and higher education has been faced with. And today what I'd like to do is talk about the impact of the pandemic on XR or VR and AR, and share with you where I think this is going. And there's a lot more developments happening than I think we're actually aware of. So we'll first of all talk about augmented and virtual reality during this period, XR's solution of social collaborative environments. I want to highlight a few innovative projects that I think are really signposts of our future, some of the challenges of implementing XR, and finally a question that I've been really wrestling with: will the pandemic launch us into the metaverse? I think it's fascinating. So initially, just a terminology here, and this is from a diagram done by my co-founder, Maya Georgieva, who influences so much of my thought in this and in this presentation and everything I do. When we talk about XR, that's really an overarching term for, you might say, a collection of technologies. There's 360 video, which also known as immersive videos or spherical videos, where you just have 3 degrees of freedom. Put on a headset, you can look around, but you can't walk through an environment. There's virtual reality, which is fully immersive. There's augmented reality, which overlays digital objects and information on the real world. And there's mixed reality, which is kind of augmented reality on steroids, where the real and the virtual worlds are intertwined and interact with each other. I'll refer to the terms separately when I'm talking about something specifically, but when I'm talking about the overall collection of technologies, we'll use the term extended reality or XR, because that seems to be the easiest way to talk about this in these days. The pandemic should have been XR's moment. This was the time for XR to really shine, for something amazing to happen. We've seen over the past couple years just absolutely amazing projects. This is a 360 video. This is climate change, which takes you on a journey through 4 different dynamics in our changing global climate. What's interesting about it is that it focuses not on the scientific concepts, but on the human cost, the effect on the economy, our livelihood, society, ultimately the impact on human beings and culture. XR is already revolutionizing medical education. There's just been stunning developments over the past 5 years, and healthcare education has embraced XR, and mainly because there's such a long tradition of simulations in the field. Doctors and nurses not only can learn within immersive environments, they can try things, they can fail, they can try again, and they can keep their skills up to date. There's been amazing developments in terms of games, particularly in the release of Half-Life Alyx by Valve. It came out in March 2020. Really not a great time to release a game, but it's still groundbreaking and revolutionary in the way that you can interact with the virtual environment of the game. If there's a door, you can open it. If there's a window or a glass bottle, you can break it. If you come across a piano in the virtual environment, you can play it. The scenes are deeply realistic and interactive in a way that I think few XR experiences have been before, and it's a doorway into our future to look at how XR will create realistic environments in the years to come. You look at a scene like this of urban desolation, and it's just every time I'm in it, I'm just so struck by the wet ground, the reflections of the water, the dust, the dirt. It's just absolutely stunning virtual environments. And so it's really, if you haven't tried it out, I really recommend it, because I think it is a sign of what's to come here over the next couple of years for everything that we do in learning, for the potential there. And then, of course, in the midst of all this, global pandemic strikes, and there's any number of charts that you can use here, but just looking at one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the fourth goal of education, some 1.5 billion learners face school shutdowns. It seemed a year ago almost impossible to ensure an inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And if the crisis has somewhat abated, and indeed it has, and that's good to see, it still continues to this day, and many countries are still struggling with how to provide learning in the midst of a pandemic. The pandemic, of course, has led to the closure of schools in 186 countries, and we've become inventive in whatever way that we could. This scene of Pakistani children learning outside. I've been always struck by the scenes in the US of university students driving in their cars to their campus parking lots and sitting in the parking lot so that they have Wi-Fi, because they don't have enough Wi-Fi at home. We've also, as faculty and administrators, we've reached deep into our educational toolbox, or ed tech tools, assuming, of course, the university or schools had resources to have one. This is a chart of workshops run during April 2020 at the University of Queensland in Australia, but it actually could have been any place at all. And you see the interest increasing from video production through discussion forums, desktop recording, to virtual classrooms. But of course, those virtual classrooms really didn't mean XR. They've meant Zoom or Teams or Meet, and video conferencing became critical to what we do to keep in touch with each other and try to provide an ongoing education for our students. It all worked okay to a degree, except that it wasn't good for larger courses, and ultimately Zoom has had some significant issues. Must be 900 articles with what's wrong with Zoom. You don't need to go out and read them all, and you probably can figure out yourself, but you only need to read one. I would highly recommend the recent study by Jeremy Bailenson, VR pioneer and professor at Stanford University, where he talks about the psychological impact of spending every day on video conferencing platforms. We have a term for it, Zoom fatigue. According to Bailenson, we're too close for comfort when we're on video conferencing. Everyone is staring at every everyone else. And it's a kind of state of hyper-arousal. We dislike watching ourselves. There are negative emotional consequences of seeing ourselves constantly. And you know that if you were in a face-to-face meeting, you'd never put up a mirror on the table and sit there and watch yourself as you were interacting with everybody else. And yet that is what we do in Zoom. We're usually trapped in a chair when we're video conferencing. There's a lot of evidence we perform better cognitively when we're moving. And finally, and I think most important, is we can't see body language, and it takes more evidence to communicate. I've taught for decades, and I know that I could sense when somebody in a class had a question, and I could signal, let's wait a few minutes, I'll get to it, or I'll acknowledge it, but student wouldn't have to say anything. In a video conferencing platform, you end up having to signal by raising your virtual hand, or you have to speak up, and it becomes disruptive of the entire event. There's ways, of course, to minimize the impact, but XR has had its own solution, which I think is really fascinating. We've seen the growth of social collaborative environments. Altspace VR, and VR chat, both of which actually started in 2013 and 2014, have been supercharged by the global pandemic. They didn't have much of a business model initially, and then they just took off. There's more recent ones, such as Mozilla Hubs, which is getting widely used in both primary education and in higher education in universities. And they provide new ways for students to connect and collaborate together. They add a deeply interactive dimension as immersive environment. And perhaps most important, they can be accessed through a flat screen. So if students don't have a VR headset, they can still step into an environment which truthfully is not as immersive as it would be if they were in a VR headset, but still overcomes many of the challenges of video conferencing platforms like Zoom. There's other ones such as Verbella, which is widely used as a platform for both learning and virtual conferences. I'm associated with iLearn, the Immersive Learning Research Network, and they used it last year for their virtual conference and use it for their upcoming one in May and June, which you should check out. And it provides an entire campus-like environment, so you can have multiple events going on simultaneously. Another one to take a look at is Engage, which is a social and collaborative platform that is used in both corporate and educational sectors. I love this particular Seem a Nicer Classroom. I think of my many years of teaching in New York City that I ever taught in a classroom that actually looked this nice. Just as a side note, though, I do have to say that I think that this is not the most effective use of these environments to recreate the real world. We should do something different. But at least here, the seating is arranged in a circle so that the people, the avatars, can easily see each other. And the last one I want to mention here, and I find this one fascinating, is Nanome, which is a more advanced platform. It does require headsets, but it actually allows you to go down to nanoscale and model and simulate proteins, chemicals, and manipulate them with your colleagues right next to you. It's being used by top pharmaceutical research facilities and in academic research institutions, and was actually used last year to help understand the coronavirus as scientists and medical researchers were trying to get a handle on it and develop a vaccine. However, unlike the other ones, this one can't be used through a flat screen. It's only through a VR headset, but it really is an advanced platform for doing work in STEM. In terms of innovative projects, which I think are a signpost of our future, there's a couple here that I just want to highlight. One, of course, is Lapster, the virtual simulation of chemistry labs that is widely used in STEM education. They were already popular prior to the pandemic, but of course they have just taken off because doing any kind of lab work in a pandemic remotely has been so incredibly challenging. And here students enter a virtual lab, they follow the same protocols they would in a real lab, and they can do it either in a headset or they can do it on a flat screen. Some of the experiments have storylines and students pursuing forensic research, which really deepens their engagement and captures their attention. And The simulation also incorporates a kind of intelligent drone lab assistant, which is that orb you see in the upper middle part of the screen. And that runs on AI, and it actually guides you through the experiments. So it can slow down if you're having trouble getting through them. It can speed up if you're doing okay. So it actually personalizes the learning to your skill level and how you're working through the progress you're making through the simulations. Arizona State University, which I'm associated with at the Shaping EDU project as an innovator in residence, has done a remarkable partnership with Dreamscape Immersive. Dreamscape Immersive is actually a Hollywood project, Hollywood entertainment project that was started in 2018. ASU and Dreamscape have struck a partnership to bring avatar-driven VR experiences to both campus-based and online courses. They're going to start with biology, eventually work their way through the sciences into other disciplines. I think it's one of the most far-reaching projects I have seen to reimagine how we would do education using VR, and it will be available both for students on campus and in XR labs and off campus through headsets or even on a flat screen. Morehouse College, which Dr. Martin Luther King attended, has partnered with Qualcomm and Victory VR to design 3 courses that will be taught in virtual reality. There will be a digital twin of the campus, and students will be taking immersive classes in biology, in world history, and one on inorganic chemistry. There's so many other projects here that I don't have time to highlight, but hopefully I will in a future talk, because there's just really amazing developments going on across the world. In terms of the challenges of implementing XR, we're faced with a tremendous number of obstacles that we need to overcome. The internet access we talked about, the hardware cost, students not having access to hardware, content distribution and device management also remain major challenges, with Lenovo, one of the few companies that's addressing it with their Think Reality platform. In terms of social VR, our platforms are still basically primitive, because the more complex the environment, the more bandwidth and the more expensive headsets and devices that you need. It really is all about rendering the number of polygons that you have on a screen. And I think one thing to do here is that educators really need to look outside their own world and see what others have done, especially cultural festivals. Cultural festivals have it easier and harder than those of us in education. Their participants aren't coming for a semester. They're not coming to get a degree, to get credits. But on the other hand, they have to onboard tens of thousands of people in a single day, in less than a day, really, and recreate an event that took place sometimes in parts of an entire city, such as Austin, Texas for South by Southwest, or Sundance Film Festival at Park City. And this is a scene from the Sundance Virtual Festival this year, where they were able to have realistic facial photos on the users' avatars. It made the avatars look more awkward in a way, but it actually enhance the connection between people, because you could see who was really there. Somebody you might recognize. You may not remember their name, but you may remember their face from having been to the event in a previous year. As we start getting deeper into this, we're going to have to think about avatar psychology in virtual worlds. Studies have shown that a presentation guided by an avatar instead of displayed on a screen, people will trust the information more. And avatar appearance actually impacts their how we receive information. Taller avatars seem to get more respect, as do those that have higher levels of realism. So these are all things we're going to have to start thinking about as our avatars become more realistic. Privacy is going to be fundamental. XR generates staggering amounts of privacy. From a 2018 study, a 20-minute video game session can record up to 2 million data points about your body movement. The question, of course, who controls that data? Who gets access to it? This diagram is from the XR Safety Initiative, which released a report in September 2020. They work with universities to develop a framework, but the real question is, will tech companies support that initiative? There's already controversy over Facebook's move to require social media accounts for their Oculus headsets, but I think in the end, the tech companies and universities and everyone is really going to have to come together on this, because privacy will remain a huge issue. Finally, the most fundamental challenge will be how we integrate XR into the learning environment. Early on, do we recognize that experience is the foundation of learning, that there's an, quote, intimate and necessary relationship between the processes of actual experience and education? His idea, of course, challenged the passive teacher-focused approach, including traditional classroom teaching methods such as rote memorization. But how do we integrate experience into our educational system? They've been largely designed to study people who in turn have studied human experience. We read, we research, we analyze, and we reproduce it in papers and projects. But what if we're not simply reading about an issue such as human migration, but we have the opportunity to experience it in a virtual environment in our educational institutions? Where does that fit in a course, in a curriculum? How do we design it? Who designs it? And how do we build moments to prepare for it and reflect on it, which Dewey said are so essential to the learning process? So that brings me to my final question here, which I've been wrestling with, is will the pandemic launch us into the metaverse? And we can define the latter as a shared and persistent virtual space, the sum of all the augmented and virtual environments and worlds accessible to us at any moment. And of course, as we move into the future, those worlds are going to be accessible to us 24/7 constantly. That not just something that we have to make a big effort to put a headset on. I think the quick answer, of course, is we're not there yet, but we're much closer than we were a year ago. I always go back to Michael Abrish's quote, the chief scientist at Oculus, and I usually listen to people from Silicon Valley with a lot of skepticism, but this is one that really sticks with me, where I think he is right in saying that VR, or the whole collection of technologies, really, he would say now AR, VR, XR, will have the same long-term impact as the personal computer, and that it will actually become the most powerful, creative, and collaborative environment that's ever existed. Think about how the computer has changed your life, the lives of your students. Think about that exponentially in terms of XR, what it will do in the future. We have coming up in the very near future advanced hardware. We know Apple is already producing some sort of immersive device. Won't have a picture of it because there are no Apple so secretive about what they do. I think it will be some kind of mixed reality glasses. Facebook's AR glasses, which they have announced, Project Aria, is already being tested out in the field. Other AR glasses are coming online and real. There's other companies that have them out or in the process of producing them. And this is going to be a game-changing event for us. I think as we move into this world, we're going to have to rethink the value of physical presence. We will be in the same virtual space with each other with a deep sense of co-presence, and our avatars will have accurate facial expressions. Facebook's Oculus Quest 3 may well incorporate face and eye tracking technology. Working remotely, of course, that means employees can spend more time with their families. Businesses can reduce cost with their offices. But this is also a double-edged sword. A study just released the other day by Microsoft noted that there's a phenomena of what they call diminishing networks. Remote teams are highly effective and much happier, but they're also much more siloed as they only communicate with each other. The same result could happen with students learning remotely in XR. They could have better access, they might do more effective learning, but they could end up being more isolated and not making random connections. And when I think all of us, when we think back to our experience in education, we think sometimes it's those random moments of meeting a student from another class, another discipline, and a partnership develops. We've seen this all the time in the arts, in research, in the sciences, in the social sciences, that people might not have met if they had been deeply siloed. So this is something we're going to have to address in the future. I think that the most significant opportunity and challenge as we move in the future will be AI and its convergence with XR. Don't ever think of XR as an isolated technology, as it will deeply linked to other digital developments. Facebook is already researching how wrist devices might be used as an interface for AR glasses, wearing wristbands with EMG sensors on them. That could be the basis for your interaction with virtual objects and virtual beings in an augmented or mixed reality environment. It's much more accurate and much more private than voice commands, and really, I think will end up being much more effective. But that system will incorporate AI that is understanding and trying to anticipate your intentions, your next actions. And of course, if you have AI doing that, the question comes up, who owns that data? Where is it stored? How do I get it? Can I delete it if I don't want someone else to have it? Am I being tracked? We're also going to have AI being used for non-human entities, non-human avatars, leading to the creation of digital beings that enhance our work and the way we learn. We have personal tutors. I envision a decade from now that students at advanced institutions will have avatars that can follow them around and help them with their learning. But again, and something like this raises a flood of questions. What do these AI-driven avatars know about us? Who writes the code that they operate by? Would they embody the biases and the preferences of their creators? The pandemic really threw us into a virtual world, but XR wasn't entirely ready just yet. It will be ready next time, and we all know that sadly we will face more local and global crises in the future. But the current pandemic has spurred the development of XR, and the boundary between the real and the virtual is already shifting rapidly. That will impact work, education, our everyday lives, and something that we don't always consider in technology, which is our cultural values. That's a topic that keeps me energized and up at night, thinking about the unseen ways that XR will transform humanity. And that is really a subject for another talk. So on that note, I will close here, and I will just say thank you. And please stay in touch through our social media accounts, and you can see more of our thought in our online work online at digitalbodies.net. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor Emery. That was amazing, very interesting and informative. We've had some really good questions come in, so even though we might be running a little bit out of time, but it would be great to perhaps respond to some of them.
Okay.
So one of the questions says, with regards to employment opportunities or jobs of the future, what subjects will students need to study, and will schools be equipped to facilitate this learning or teaching?
I think in terms of the jobs, it's really hard to say. Obviously, we move toward more and more technical jobs as we automate processes, and that decreases the amount of labor that we have. I don't think schools are really ready. What I do think that everyone needs to do, and this is really incumbent upon us as educators, is to focus on digital literacy. Digital literacy is going to be so important. And by that, I don't mean in the traditional sense that we've used the term, which is how to read, how to assess sources online. I mean that in a much larger scope of digital and media literacy, because we will be in immersive environments. And when we step into those kind of immersive environments, will we have the skills to ask the questions and say, who created this? Is this faithful? Is this not faithful to the reality that we know? We already have deep, deep challenges with fake news, with people putting stuff online with social media. Just imagine 5 to 10 years from now. I mean, my worst nightmare is that we'll have fake realities. And I know we're going there, and it's going to be, the only way we will stop that is it will be us as educators doing it to give students the skills they need to work in immersive environments.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for answering that. And another question says, what impact has the pandemic had on the learning of students and their prospects for the future? And do you believe XR is able to provide solutions for learners who have missed out on years of education?
I really do think it can provide solution, and it can help us catch up, because I think a lot of us right now in education are talking about, I don't know if we'd call it a lost generation, but at least a lost couple of years. And I know even in New York City, we have hundreds of thousands of students that have not had an adequate education over the past year. And that is true around the globe, not just here, but even in developed countries, it's been a huge challenge. And I think that XR can provide an opportunity to catch up, but that means, of course, bandwidth, which is as essential as having electricity, and it also means ultimately getting access to devices. They're getting cheaper, less and less expensive. I mean, the Oculus Quest headset is now $299. I keep saying it needs to get under $100. I want to see it under 99 US dollars, and then to me it becomes actually feasible to start to get these out to students. But I think that will probably take partnerships between schools and governments and schools and technology companies to push this forward, because the educational institutions are not going to have the resources themselves to do it, except for the ones that are very well off.
Perfect, thank you. And that really ties in with the next question. You kind of answered that as well, because the next question was, we've heard a lot about the future and the changes, but who is actually implementing these strategies in the classroom and learning space? And I think part of it is, you know, being expensive and the cost related to that. So the more, you know, the cheaper it gets, I think the more schools and education institutions in general would be able to really afford implementing XR in their curriculums.
Oh, completely agree. And you see a lot of institutions doing pilot projects. My co-founder, Maya Georgieva, is doing amazing work at the New School, and they have a pilot project where they're getting headsets out to students in 4 different courses, and so that they will be able to use VR as part of the learning process. And you have other pilot projects all across the globe where people are doing this. But on the other hand, again, cost and bandwidth come up. The digital divide is more stark, I think, than we've ever realized.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Emery. Thank you for being with us. For the audience, you'll be redirected to a short survey right after we end this session. So please tell us what you thought. We're on social media as well during the event. So follow us at Guest Education on Twitter and use the hashtag #GuestGlobal. A massive thank you once again, Professor Emery Craig, and everyone who tuned into this session. For all the immersive tech enthusiasts, don't go anywhere, as our final session of the summit is coming up in approximately 10 minutes. And we'll also focus on fusing immersive technology with meaningful learning. Thank you so much, Professor Emery.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Take care, and bye-bye for now.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.